Great, we're all here.
Okay, welcome everybody, and welcome to our guests from the public and the audience who we can't see, but I guess you can see us. Anyway, you all have an agenda. I'm going to take just a minute or two, or maybe 3 or 4 along with Jacques to do an overview and updates. I sent out yesterday this sort of rearrangement of our notes from last time with what I hoped were sort of trying to bring together answers or sort of resolutions to some of the issues that came up. And I just want to run through them. I think most of them, are very non-controversial and will just allow us to move to the next, just keep going. And some of them probably require some discussion. Then we'll talk about the timeline. And then we'll go into sort of the substance of what is the public engagement. And if there's time, Jacques and I have a fun activity, but I'm not so sure we're going to get to that, in which case we'll wait on it. Okay, so in terms of the just the update, here are the 2 things that I wanted to raise is, so we'll do the timeline stuff later, but on the innovative assessments, the one, and we can come back to this, I think it comes up in the memo, is I read the various things, Jessica, and it's all interesting, and I am very interested in this in the long run. What I took from that is that there's nothing in there that really speaks to things that would alter how we would go about this STAR framework revision, because it's also long-term. So whereas I was somewhat convinced last time that we should integrate the discussions of the new assessment with the accountability framework, because maybe a new assessment could carry some of the weight, I'm now dubious about that. So I'm inclined to just sort of say, let's do the accountability framework, and let's move to an assessment. So just hold that thought and we'll come back and discuss it. And then one thing that everybody has raised and we've all been thinking about is OSCE engagement. So I wanted to ask Jacques just to sort of talk about the plan for that.
Thank you, Ruth. We've talked in length, you guys, just to make sure that we engage OSCE, and we talked a little bit more today. And I've talked to some of our peers to make sure that we are in the same line of thought process as far as engaging OSCE, and just going back and to make sure that we're working collaboratively. We know that we have an interim superintendent at this particular time, understanding that she is trying to get through this particular point, and there may be another person that comes on at a particular time. So one of the things that I'm going to do is to make sure that I reach out to her as part of this committee personally, to set up a time with her and just say where they are, tell them the time frame that we're going to try to establish for reporting out, and just making sure that we have their support to move along in this as far as what some of their agenda items are. We do want to do this in a collaborative manner. So that's something that we talked about in length prior to getting prepared for this. We just want to make sure that everybody's on board and all trains are moving in the same direction at the same time. So that's where we are right now. And I'll be reporting how that meeting going. I'm trying to do that within the next week or so. So I'll be able to report that out next time that we talk.
And also, and I think then Jacques may go to the next meeting of Emily and Zach with OSCE to just also, so we'll see how that plays out, but that would be that's the idea.
And I see, Jessica, you have a question. You have your hand raised, so to speak.
Yeah, so I really appreciate that, Jacques, and I do think that having that upfront collaborative conversation with OSCE is important, and I'm glad you all are taking that to heart. My question is this: I know that in the past, when we have asked OSCE about this, they have not been on board with it. Mm-hmm. So what I'm curious about is whether or not we need to think about a set of plans. One that says we're making recommendations to a receptive OSCE, mm-hmm. and a second one, we're making plans to a reluctant OSCE. Mm-hmm. And whether there are ways in which we might behave or framing for our work that might be different in the case of a receptive Aussie versus a reluctant Aussie. Just because that conversation is still forthcoming, I feel like it's important for us to sort of scenario plan for both possibilities.
And in response to that, I definitely appreciate that, Representative Sutter. When I had my first initial meeting with the interim superintendent, I told her what I had campaigned on and that this was one of the issues. And then we created this committee to do just that. And I appreciate our president for doing that and putting us both here, me and Ruth, to co-chair it. And she seemed receptive to that. I'm hoping, even after that meeting, when she seemed receptive to it, that she's still receptive to it and that we can move along collaboratively. Now, I also agree with you that, you know, things change over a course of period of time, and people's priorities change somewhat. And what does that look like for us as a committee, as a body, as a government body, to move along without a somewhat, as you said, resistant Aussie? In the event that is the case, I think we need to discuss what are the avenues that we use to continue to elevate this. I believe that it is important, and that it's something that we have to address. I believe the pandemic has made this an urgent issue, so to speak, because we really do want to know where the inequities are. And I think a lot of them has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So we need to do this, and we need to make sure that we're moving along at the same time. So what does that look like? We can discuss that here, as you just said, and kind of put a plan together if they should be resistant to it. And hopefully, you know, we don't have to deploy plan B and plan A works. I'm a collaborative kind of person. I would much rather have your support and move along together, as opposed to saying, okay, I got to go around you and go to maybe a council member or some other individual that is supportive of this, or raising the issue in the public square and getting the public square to come back and say, this is the issue we want OSSI to focus on.
I have a quick question, and I think we're going to get to this later when we discuss the timeline too. But I do want to make sure that the full board has a chance to weigh in on the plan and the timeline prior to meeting again with OSSI. Like, I think it's important for us to know what our timeline is as an agency prior to doing that. So I think after April 7th, and the board should be adopting the work plan in the April public meeting. And so I think once we know what the timeline is for the full agency, we'll have a much better sense of when that next meeting may or should happen, because then we can take that to them.
And Jean-Paul, I agree with you. And those are some of the questions that I'll ask in my initial meeting, so that you guys can plan accordingly. And that is, you know, part of the reason why to reach out to her and meet with her and everything, our superintendent, to find out basically what's on her timeline, you know, because she does have a lot of things on her plate. And I want to be respectful of that, and the timeline, so that we can craft a timeline that works for both of us, and meeting that. And your staff, of course, that supports us. Okay. Yeah,
that makes sense. I mean, I think it would be great if we would, I think it would be great to have that information for sure.
So the one thing I just want to say on that, which I think is consonant with everything else, is so our timeline will get discussed at the working meeting, which is April 7th, and in effect adopted. I mean, it won't, not formally publicly, but in effect will be agreed to. And then if I'm right, the OSSI meeting with the officers is the following week. And so the idea would be, sort of in an iterative way, first Jacques is going to be reaching out timeline, and then in that next week, the officers and Jacques could be meeting with OSSI with this timeline, so that by the time we come back here for our April meeting, we'll be sort of well along that.
Yeah, I think it's all within that same week. I would note that the timelines that are being suggested by committees are not necessarily what will be finalized next week. They may have to adjust based on other committee priorities or other agency priorities. So that's what I'm trying to caution about, setting a timeline here that may not work with the full agency. And I think that will happen we'll have that discussion next week about what priorities are where and how to arrange them. Because we just don't have the capacity to do everything that the committees want to do all at the same time. But I assume that we're still supposed to go forward and come up with our best plan today. Absolutely, absolutely. Yes.
And anyway, so I think that'll work. Okay, very good. All right. So if nothing more on that, I'm going to go to this memo from the other day, or this email from the other day. And I just want to run through it. And if it's easy as pie, we're just going to go right through it. And where we need to stop, we'll stop. So on the first one, there was this question.
Sorry, Ruth, I apologize. I don't mean to interrupt. Do you want me to share it or no?
Yes. Does everybody have it? Should John Paul put it in the chat? Probably easiest to put it in the chat.
I have it.
I'm a transparency person, John Paul. So, you know, if you want to share it, I'm okay with that for other individuals who may not be privy and have a point of reference for the conversation. Thank you, John Paul.
All right. So, okay. So the first one is the, so we talked last meeting, and then there was a little back and forth and some emails as well about, are we doing the STAR framework? Are we doing the report card? So the way I see it is our job, the charge to this committee is to make recommendations to revive the STAR framework. That is the accountability framework, how we rate the schools. Because a lot of the discussion we've had is that we may want to make revisions that include a dashboard. Some of those dashboard ideas start to look like some of the stuff that has been on the report card. And in that sense, there's not a neat divide, but the divide for us is this is about responding to the ESSA requirement for how are we going to, report these basic things out to meet their requirements. For the bottom 5%, there has to be a summative score. For everybody else, it doesn't have to be a summative score, though it could be. It could also be a dashboard. So what are the indicators that we want to include in that? What metrics are we going to use to show that? And at least for the bottom 5%, and perhaps for others, what are the weights? Those are our tasks. Does that, and then what I'm thinking is that as we go through, we sort of keep a parking lot of, and here's some other things we want to make sure that are easily available to parents to look at. And, they'll be, again, either on this report card or on a dashboard. It's a little, no clear line. At some point, I think we'll need to make a line. I don't think we need to do that today or yet. Does that sound right?
Ruth, that sounds right to me. I just have one question that I want to sort of put on the parking lot for us. It's around the dashboard piece. It shows up in a few places as though we are likely to do so, and then in one place as a clear question of whether we will or we won't. I want to state up front, in my mind, we're still on a question of whether we will or we won't. But if that's not the case, I hope we can talk about that.
No, absolutely. We are at the place where we have not decided. What I tried to do everywhere is sort of say dashboard / summative / both. At this moment in our conversation, that's what I'm referring to it as. And at some point, I think tentatively before our public engagement, and then in a proposal that we make to the board, we would make a choice, a decision, but we're not there yet.
Okay. I would also, I'll save this for when we come back, but I think that's a key question. I hope we ask for public engagement rather than making a proposal before public engagement.
Well, let's take that up when we get to public engagement as we sort of talk about that. And I agree, it's a key question when we talk about what the public engagement is. But okay, so I'm checking off number 1 that we're in agreement. All right. Number 2, there was a back and forth last time around the extent to which the accountability framework should be reflecting the kinds of things that parents needed to know to make choices, or the extent to which it was supposed to reflect what kind of the state, experts, us, whatever thought was high quality for school. And we went around on it, and I think at various points, different of us were on different or both sides. Speaking for myself, I think I was on multiple sides at various points. But the point is, in the end, what we are putting together is the state framework. It will reflect what we think the state should describe as, should count as quality. And for each of us, how we come to that decision about what should be in that, what does reflect quality. We're going to have different views about how we get there. And I think that's the point. So I don't think we have to decide, yes, it's mostly about parents, it's mostly about preferences. We're going to all have, we're going to come down on some side, so in favor of some set of indicators. Does that sound right and good to everybody? Okay.
We're in agreement.
All right.
Mhm.
So the next, and this we just, we went back and forth on different issues. The very interesting one was around re-enrollment. And, you know, if you, re-enrollment is an indicator that has a very strong systemic bias. I think the highest except for proficiency, if I'm remembering. And so including it definitely creates a tilt against schools that have more at-risk students because housing stability is an issue. So that's an argument for taking it out. But as with all of these indicators, leaving it in creates an incentive in theory for schools to try to maintain newly homeless or moving students as students. So that's a plus. And I say that just to say these are trade-offs. And I think it's something explicitly that we want to keep track of as we go through all of these indicators. And I would think even make it explicit, I think as part of our public engagement. So again, just sort of informative, all good, all right. Okay, 4 and 5, I'm going to ask Jacques to also weigh in on this because this is something that he helped me have a real breakthrough on this, which is, you know, we've talked always about we want this framework. Partly it's an accountability tool, partly it's, you know, it helps everybody understand what's going on in schools, but part of it should be that it's a tool for getting assistance to schools that need it on the things they need assistance about. And I think speaking for everybody, we want that to happen. That's part of its purpose. In my mind, it's always been like, yeah, and how are we going to make that happen since we don't have the reins? And the way Jacques put it in terms of some phasing helped me really break through on this. So I'm just going to turn it over to you to talk about that.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. So as Ruth and I were talking about this particular item is that the first thing that we came up with that in the phase-in is that we wanted to provide an accountability tool where parents had something that they could hold schools accountable to. And I think Representative Sutter, you and I talked about this as well, that we can hold the schools accountable to, but we can also hold the system accountable to, because there are different levels of accountability that we talk to. It's hard to just blame a school and talking to school leaders and stuff like that, when we know a lot of what they're receiving and what they're doing as far as resources come from the system or the LEAs, specifically for those LEAs such as DCPS, which has multiple schools. So it's not just a reflection on the school, it's a reflection on the total LEA. And so there's a process in this is what we're doing is to make sure that we hold the school accountable for what's happening in the school, but we also have to hold the LEA and the system accountable as well. And so that's kind of like the phase. So what we're doing right now is creating an accountability tool where parents can kind of look at, you know, what's happening in the school and make, you know, intelligent decisions on where they want to place their child and the things that are happening. But then there's also an aspect of it, which will be the next phase of how do we use this and how does this become the apparatus in which we as individuals or other individuals use this as a tool to hold other decision makers accountable, where basically people are using this accountability tool, kind of like with the charter schools and saying, okay, this is what's happening. This is the level where they are for this particular LEA. And this is the reference points for them, whether we're testifying in front of a particular group or something, you know, to me, there's phasing. And that's what I was trying to describe to to Ruth when we were having this discussion. So there is different aspects about this, specifically because of how DC is structured. A jurisdiction that has a lot of choice, a lot of things that are going on there. There needs to be a way that we look at this particular accountability tool as opposed to a jurisdiction that does not have the same amount of choice that we have. So that's why I was saying our LEAs, when we say LEAs, is a little bit different than some other jurisdictions. And if this eventually becomes the tool of accountability, which I think, and I've heard at some particular times, that even charter schools may want to say, okay, we're going to do away with tiering, and we're going to use I keep using STAR because we don't have any other reference point at this time, this particular accountability framework for all of our schools throughout our whole ecosystem. There's not two, one for charters and one for DCPS schools, but one accountability tool. So those are some of the conversations that we were having. And I would love to hear you guys' comments, both yours and Carlene's comments on that.
Before that, I want to add one thing, and to just make this part super clear, is that part of the phasing is that once we have the tool, then we can be like advocates, and whether it's at the council or, maybe we'll have the authority, who knows, make the case that the assistance connects to the assistant funding, things also that might come out of a school quality report. We'd be advocating to make that connection and doing what we could to ensure that they did connect.
And to put this in real time real quick, before we hear some commentary, right now you're hearing from the public as a whole, don't cut funding, don't cut teachers and things like that. If we do this correctly, this would be the tool thereby where whether it's us as we're advocating for, or any other group would say, okay, I pulled the information, the accountability information from this particular accountability framework, and this is what's happening at this particular school, and this is the justification of why we should not. This would be that tool that we would be using to substantiate when we're in front of the council or other decision makers about resources, or why they should not. That's where eventually I'm trying to get this accountability tool to. First is to the parents, of course, is the first phasing of what we need to do, and then there's the next phase of the LEA being accountable in the system. So, comments. Go right ahead. I think I'm gonna go with Carlene first. I'm gonna go with Carlene first because she has not said anything yet. I want to give her that opportunity. I want to give my ward 8.
Taking it all. I guess my immediate thought or thoughts are, how do we or do we need to, separate or think about, what's a tool for accountability and then what's a tool for decision making? Because someone can decide to go to a school and just, a bunch of kids just move, but there are no actions to actually hold something or someone accountable. People just might look and be like, well, I'm just not sending my kids to that school, and no one's actually using that information to take it and go and say well, what's going on with these trends? But then I'm also thinking, some of that information is helpful, because should the public decide to look and say well, I'm noticing certain trends, with this LEA, or I'm noticing certain trends, in my, immediate district or something like that. I think it's helpful, but I'm just thinking kind of off the bat, I don't know, does decision-making, the choice piece, always equal accountability? Or do folks just decide they see certain either demographics or ratings, and then decide but they're just not going to deal with it and enroll somewhere else? And that's where I guess the true accountability comes in, where the public or other people or policymakers have to look at that information and say what's going on when they see certain info. So that was kind of what listening to the discussion, what was kind of popping up in my mind.
And that's a great question. Before I go to you, Jessica, it's a great question, because at the end of the day, we have to really define what this is, and it really is accountability tool. Now, it's used for a lot of different things, but it's really in its true sense of creating ESSA, the whole act and everything like that. And this particular part of ESSA, the act, is to create an accountability tool. What other individuals use it for, where we have the stars and things like that, are kind of byproducts. But at the end of the day, we're trying to make sure that we're holding schools accountable. Parents are able to hold schools accountable, and other decision makers, so to speak, can hold our schools or those LEAs accountable. And that's what I'm trying to prioritize, is the accountability aspect of it. So that's kind of my response to that particular question. And Jessica, you had something to add as well?
Yeah, I think we have to be thoughtful about the fact that we have one very large LEA with enormous variability in the resources provided to schools inside it as an LEA, DCPS. And then we have 66 LEAs where there's a lot more consistency in resources applied across schools within the LEA. Part of that is that they're smaller, and part of that is that they serve a more homogeneous population. So when you look at any of the LEAs in the charter sector, there is far less variability between schools inside a single LEA, in variability of the special ed population served, variability in the at-risk population served, variability in the racial and ethnic demographics served. I would say, just off the top of my head, looking at the charter LEAs with multiple campuses, the greatest variability is probably at Center City, because there's a pretty distinct set of racial and ethnic and home language demographics in its 6 campuses. But I worry that we're trying to design a tool that is holding schools accountable for things that only schools can do, when in some cases the school is also the LEA. I'm thinking of in Ward 6, Kingsman Academy, or Washington Global, where it's a single school and an LEA, and other LEA schools where there's a whole bunch of things happening. So I use the example of some of the things that are in the grid further down in this notes are impossible for schools to be responsible for. Facilities, impossible. That can't be part of this because it's not a school level thing. On the other hand, there are some things that I don't know how we would disentangle. Re-enrollment, for instance, or attendance, between the LEA policy and the school level policy. Does that make sense? So I worry that we're trying to solve a really complex equation where the variables are so different among our LEAs. And I don't want us to overpromise on something that we simply won't be able to wholly achieve. I think it's a good goal, but I don't know that we should expect ourselves to get all the way there.
And I think by the very nature of our makeup or our ecosystem, you raise some very valid points that will come out as we're doing this work and everything like that. But what I want to point to as a group and as a committee is that we're the one group that is looking across the entire ecosystem at the whole system. A lot of times what we and a lot of our work is doing, it bifurcates DCPS against charters and everything. But this is the one thing that actually looks at the whole ecosystem and tries to look at them on a holistic type of sense. Will we be perfect? I think that's a stretch, as I said. But this is the place where we really can kind of look at and say, okay, how close can we come to that area so that we're judging all our schools on a very fair basis, and that we're also, as I've said over and over again throughout campaigning and to each one of you, is that we're showing indicators of where inequities are, not indictments of what schools are not doing or where they're failing, and where hardworking teachers and people and staff are being blamed for stuff that are beyond their control. That's what really is my goal in holding people accountable for.
Carlene, you go. Sorry.
Somehow I hit my podcast. Sorry, I lost you. Okay, here we go. I can see you now. I appreciate Representative Sutter mentioning the piece about, how literally, because of the number the DCPS has, can swing certain matrix one way or the other. And so I do think, and we can probably, I know Jock was mentioning formula, and we don't have to get into this now, but we might want to consider, because basically I've seen it where digging into special education data, whatever DCPS would do, it would basically can go one way or the other, and you didn't get the nuances of, so, and I think it's important because it says, well, this is what the whole state is doing, state of, DC is doing. And you miss some of the nuances of what's happening at our other LEAs. So I would like us to maybe, as a footnote or element or whatever in this accountability framework, not necessarily, and again, it's something that, not necessarily pit the two against, or, you weaponize it, but I think it will be really good information for, especially like OSSI or whoever else on the, government side, or whoever else wants to, truly hold accountability, to see some interesting numbers of when, we insert DCPS and this, numbers fluctuate one way, we take this out. Because really, I mean, even when you pull the charts together, it wasn't enough to like it's for special, I'm also putting this for special education data on that hat, but I just also wonder, like, when does it happen to other areas of our data in the state when you kind of insert or take out, but it wasn't enough for even like our larger network. So it's just kind of interesting. So I think we should at least footnote, bookmark that in whatever we develop in conversations to get feedback on from folks.
So
Thank you.
Two comments, two questions. A question to Carlene. So are you talking about in a way that part of what we get through this process is a lot of data, and we want to make sure that we're getting data that allows us to properly disaggregate, given that they're two different systems? Is that?
Yeah, I guess my end goal is resource allocation or technical assistance, or I don't want to just like whatever data we have, I want it to eventually lead to some solutions. And I'm wondering, are there just certain nuances in, Jock keeps using the word ecosystem, like, in the ecosystem that we are missing, because especially when we zoom all the way out to state level accountability, we mesh everyone together, and which we should, because we want to know what the state, like what our government resources are, supporting. But then it's like, I'm wondering if sometimes maybe pipelines for direct need might be getting missed, because sometimes we're looking at big data that, everyone's doing. It could be some really great things happening somewhere on either end. That, could be lessons learned, or, professional development, something else, so yes, data, but then I'm just kind of thinking like, what will be the outcome of it, or what will be the use of it? And I'm hoping that, because we, I don't know. And basically, I'm just getting to, I think it is some merit into whatever this framework is, to, pull out certain things so we can see, great pluses and minuses. But I also like the point of, we don't want to pit the systems against you. And again, it also could go to, what information is available. Of course, everything can be public, but I'm also kind of thinking, what information is just really good for OSSI to have as a state education agency, versus saying like, do we, want to put this on like my school DC website, and all of a sudden it's a battle royale for the same kids. So just want to get out there.
And I think that's a great conversation when we start digging into the metric, what we're going to put on as we talk about dashboards and stuff like that, what's going to be measured and what the weights are going to be. That's where that really gets real for everybody, so that we don't do one particular side of this service or pit them against each other, in an unfair manner. I think that's where the conversation is going to be really interesting.
The other comment I wanted to make on sort of what everybody was saying, and I think especially on this issue of schools don't have the same, schools, we want to make sure that we're judging schools based on what schools can be judged on. And when we go down actually to the next one, which is what are sort of the guiding questions about how we pick our criterion, our indicators. One of them should be, to that point, to what extent is this something that the school has responsibility for or control over? Because if it's not, and I agree, buildings is an example, it doesn't belong here. And there's going to be somewhere it's tricky, and that's part of what we have to figure out. All right. So, okay. So now we're on 6. Thank you all. Thank you, Jacques, for leading us through this and for helping me with that breakthrough period. All right, on 6. So what I tried to do was just pull together again out of the last discussion, and I think it all did come up in the last discussion. I may have pulled some things from other conversations, but I don't think so. This is just sort of the list of criteria based on which we want to pick our indicators that we want to think about. And part of what I'm thinking about is as we move through this and as we go into public engagement, you know, part of what we're going to want to focus on ourselves and part of what we will want our public engagees to focus on and our fellow board members to focus on is these questions. I mean, to what extent does it, you know, if we look at a given indicator, to what extent does it reflect, and here I'm just reading, does it speak to the quality of the work that gets done in the building? I think that was a quote from somebody, I think Jacques last time. To what extent does a particular element reflect school quality versus systemic bias? That's sort of, you know, we talked about that in terms of the re-enrollment, but it comes up with everything. It was sort of the initial reason for taking on this project. To what extent does a particular element or indicator have an incentive effect that's a positive versus a negative? To what extent is it within the control of the school versus the city or the LEA? So that's sort of the first set. That's sort of the lenses we want to use in discussing this. And we want to, I think, engage the public with those lenses. And then there's another piece, which is E here, which is, you know, it's part of the weighting, but it's also, I think, part of what we probably want to include in a dashboard if we have that, which is the how each of these plays out with different subgroups, right? So the subgroups could be demographic. If a school does really well with its non-at-risk students, but terrible with its at-risk students, that needs to be part of what is public and seen. If they do really well with some groups and not other groups, that's important, it needs to be seen. And we might also construct subgroups that help us understand the school better. And that's this issue, for example, of we might want to look separately at students who have been at a school for a long time versus those that just arrived. And because if a school is, you know, taking in a lot of students suddenly, they may not be able to do a good job with those students, but maybe they do a really good job if they have sort of 4 years to work with them. And so we might want to look at both of those. One that I wrote in myself, I don't think it is on your copy, is G, which would be, we want to look at how this indicator could help us drive assistance, right? So for example, if you knew that in climate, that one of the issues was students didn't feel like they had an adult to go to, you know, that's something that the school needs to work on versus something that doesn't really lead you to assistance. And then the last part of this is just that, I mean, my thought is we'll just keep a running list of these and we'll take them off, we'll add to them, we'll grow it and shrink it as we do public engagement and as we move ourselves towards having some recommendations. Should I just take all that as a yep?
I'm just thinking, oh, I'm thinking language. Well, I don't know why this is, I won't say bother me, but it just catches my ear. The we, I just want to make sure, and you probably already doing this, but making sure that, you know, it's like public, it's a, you know, a variety of thoughts that are pulled into collective process and not necessarily like what this group believes. And that might be what is meant by we, but I just, since it's going to be in the work plan, just might want to think about how the wording can reflect stakeholder engagement.
That is a good question. Let me just tell you how I think of it. It is an evolving we, right? Like to begin with, it's what are we thinking because we're creating a conversation, and then we're broadening the conversation and the we gets bigger. What do other people think? And then at a certain point, we have lots and lots of ideas and each of us has to decide, and that's another we. So it's sort of but we're all kind of learning and discussing and debating across this path. Does that?
So this is like not necessarily, this is just what this group is going to do, not necessarily.
Well, it's what these are questions that ultimately, that in the beginning, we have to ask ourselves, because we're moving this conversation. It is a set of questions we are going to ask others, the public, other stakeholders, and our peers on the board, and get a sense of what that much broader we thinks. So yeah, it's like today it's what do we think, but at the public engagement meeting, it's what do we broadly, what do you and the audience think? And then at some point, you know, the 9 of us have to vote.
And one thing I want to also state, and I've had these conversations with most of the individuals here on the committee, is that we don't actually start from scratch. There was a task force. There was community engagement during that process. That there is, I don't know how that was archived. I talked to John Paul and other individuals and stuff like that, where there were some indicators. Now, when I say that, not everything that came out of the community, not to be super critical of what we have right now, because I am kind of critical of it, but not everything that was stated by the community found its way into what we currently have. So there is a little bit of history that we already have from the task force of community engagement, of what was said, how it was said, those representatives that were there, what were some of those statements. And I think it's incumbent on us at some point to kind of say, okay, there were recommendations that were given, there were things that came in that produced what we have currently, you know, and I have 2 doctors here, policy, and we know that we don't just bring things out of the air. We look at some of the research that has been done before and see exactly how we got to where we are right now, and how do we correct it, and what actually went into that policy, and what was implemented, what was left out, and what was the recommendations. That, to me, some of that is part of this as well. Not just saying, okay, we don't like it, let's start all over, you know, and let's start from scratch. New constituency, go back to those same individuals.
Yeah, oh, sorry, you go.
Build on what Carlene was saying. I think that's right, Jacques. I think that we have the reports from the past, both the ESSA task force report and OSCE's engagement with the public on metrics. What I would hope, though, and I'm aligned with Carlene here, that we are careful about how we narrow down the funnel of what we present to the public, so that we don't come to too many conclusions internally before going to the public. That we might say, okay, here's what the ESSA task force did, here's what the OSCE metric data showed, and here are the questions we have from the public. Let's go to them. Then we might take that and make a proposal, and then go back to the public and say, okay, here's how we arrived at our proposal. What do you think of our proposal? And Ruth, this is what I was getting at the beginning. To me, question 8 here goes as letter H. It's not, we go out with a proposal about a dashboard versus summative, but it's a question we ask of the public. And then we come back with, here's what we heard from the public, and this is our proposal on how to handle it based on that feedback. That would be my preference.
Mm-hmm. And so, you know, I'm gonna raise my hand and hopefully acknowledge myself at the same time. But what I would say to that is I agree wholeheartedly with both of you guys on that, because I think that was the process before, and that's got us where we are right now. Whereas things were narrowed to a certain point, and we went out, and it really wasn't indicative of what the community really wanted to hear. It got narrowed and narrowed and narrowed, and they say, okay, go out. This is what you guys are going to talk to them about, you know. And we don't want to do that, you know. At the same time, we don't want to make it so substantial. I believe a term that was used this week when I was talking to someone, we can't boil the ocean, is what was used at one particular point. But we do want to make sure that we do hear from the communities and stakeholders and those who are interested in this, and do that. not trying to formulate things for them, put it in such a frame that it's almost already decided for them, and they're just picking, not really, engaging and giving us their opinion. They're just picking, and I don't want that to happen either.
So I think I agree, but I want to say it a little bit differently. First of all, I totally agree with putting H in that list, because I agree it is one of those, it's a similar question. So that's fine. We talked last time, we'll get to this. This is the next thing we're going to do when we talk about engagement. And I guess we need to get there, is to do sort of some of the engagement is, I think it was Carlene's word, raw. Like, we just want to know what you think, in a raw sense. But then I think we want to, in that engagement, because I don't think we're going to be at this for a year, in that engagement, we then move to some formulations. So, you'd ask people, and we'll get to this, so I don't want to overdo it right here, but you might ask people at that engagement to look, for example, at different ways that other districts or other states have done this, so that there's something there that they can respond to that's more specific. You might ask a question about, some people use dashboards, some use stars, some use grades, and ask them about that. You might say some people use climate and some people don't, or some people use this and some people use that. And so I think we do want to formulate for people some options, I guess is the way I would think about it, so that we're getting some response on options. And we'll have some ideas of those options from the previous engagements.
Okay. I think we're good there. We want to move us along, Ruth?
Yeah, okay. So actually that was number 9,
Okay.
the raw, and the raw followed by the more informative. So if nothing more to say there, I'll go. So 10 is on the innovative assessment, which is really what I raised earlier, that I just insofar as the learning about some of the innovative alternative assessments now could help us make this accountability tool, could speak to the accountability tool. We should do it quickly, but insofar as it can't, then it doesn't need to be a high priority in this particular charge, but would need to be very soon, or would be like the next thing we would take up. And that's my sense of reading the stuff that you had sent, Jessica, is that we're just too far from having it in place to be a factor in the accountability framework. Although I love some of the ideas. I actually am a fan of Louisiana, just to say. So
I think you're right, Ruth. I don't think it can be a precondition to what we're changing, what we're seeking to change. What I would encourage us to be thoughtful about is, there are a lot of folks who don't like park. I'm not sure I understand that as compared to, say, the other consortia assessments that exist. But that's a message I feel like I've heard loud and clear from folks who've come to testify. And so I simply hope we anticipate that there will be pressure to shift our state assessment. And because these things are so expensive and take so much time, I hope that at least it's a question we're asking of OSSE. Where are they in this conversation, even if it's not one we're taking up as part of this, so that we can communicate back to constituents about what's happening.
I think that's a great way to think about it.
And we have to be honest about that, because I think some of the problems that we've had is not understanding all the politics that are being played, but not only where OSSE is on the park and stuff like that, where the administration as a whole is as well. Those are some conversations after we, as we're talking to stakeholders and we talk to our interim superintendent, we also have to elevate that and talk to other individuals and see where they're headed with that and where the administration is headed with that. I hear the same conversations that when we're one of the last jurisdictions to use park, and it's used in a number of ways, whether it's the impact evaluations and all the other things that it's used for. Where are we on that particular issue? Those are some of the things that we'll have to have some conversations around, just to understand what we're putting together, what will be there in the finished product for a long period of time. So
all right. All right, we have half an hour left and two important things to do. One is to talk about the timeline and one is to talk about public engagement. And the public engagement one, at least my thought was that it would be pretty substantive. Like, what do we want to do? Who do we want to talk to? How are we going to do it? Do we want to have a survey, award meetings, whatever? And then the timeline, I put it first, but actually it really kind of grows out of the engagement in a way, but we definitely want to be final on the timeline. So can we spend no more than like 6 minutes on the timeline and see if we have anything that is major on that, or if we're okay, and then go to the public engagement?
And I'm really ready for this particular conversation because I know this is one that is, you know, has so many variables, as we've used the word over and over again, because I know we want to get something done. We want to get something quality done. We want to meet certain deadlines that we've set for ourselves and stuff like that. But we also want it to be something that we get support on and meets the deadlines of some of the individuals at the top of the conversation that we talk to that have agenda items themselves. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. So let's have so where we can kind of decide and get to an area where we can really say, this is what we can work with.
All right. So I'll just start it by saying, I mean, I feel like, again, if we think about, there's different charges in front of us. One is recommendations to alter the STAR framework. One is, once we have that, to use that as a basis for advocating new policies so that we connect assistance to schools that need it. We want to do something around new assessment. But the first thing is this making recommendations to revise the STAR framework so that it better reflects the various things we've talked about, not the bias, perhaps the broader view and so on. If we want to do that and have it have a new system in place by December 2022, which is when the next STAR rating would be issued, we need to get something to, we need to have a set of good recommendations by the end of the summer. And that's what this is based on. And I know some people were saying it's a short timeline. I mean, it is and it's not. I think there's a set of things we need to talk about. We need to figure out how to do it. As Jacques said, a lot of this has been discussed among many groups in the past. And I will also say, even before Jacques' ESSA task force, there was a previous ESSA committee that also did a lot of engagement and had a memo. Actually, I should pull that out about some stuff. So there's a past here. And if we want to get this changed so that our schools don't experience this particular rating system again, we have to get it done. We have to have a set of recommendations by the end of the summer. So let's talk about that. The one thing I want to throw in here is that I did raise with Emily and Zach something that actually has come up before, which is possibly having our summer break in July and meeting in August. And the reason for that, there's a broad reason and a narrow reason. The broad reason is schools are starting up in August, and it's always very weird. I have always thought that the schools are starting, everything's starting, and we don't have our first meeting until mid to late September. It's weird. And it makes a lot more sense for us to be meeting in August and taking our break in July, period. If we did that this time, it would mean we could adopt this in August, not July. So for people who want to have more time, and more time is always better, it would also solve that problem. We don't know whether that's possible. I've run up the flagpole. I think there's some sympathy for it. So just FYI.
Ruth, I would just throw out that I'm not sure I concur on the July-August situation for a few reasons, but one of them being that we've already scheduled some CISAC stuff to happen in July because of a proposed, the expectation of an August break, including that teachers go back to school in August and they don't really want to be hearing from us or talking to us at that time. So we front loaded stuff during the summer when things were in session. So I would just wonder a little bit about how that throws off some schedules already in place, to change that in April, for instance, because that would be when we would next be able to vote on our calendar. My one hesitation with just a number of pieces of what you just said, it goes back to this notion of the engagement we just talked about in the memo, which is, I absolutely agree that we should build on what has already been researched and done. What I don't want is for that to limit engagement with current people. So when you say before the ESSA task force, there was also an ESSA committee, all that is true, but just as our board has changed over time and the circumstances have changed over time, the residents of the city have changed over time, people who have become engaged in public education, in activism have changed over time. And so what I don't want us to do is to count out new voices and say, oh yeah, well, we already talked about all that. I would hope that we would make sure that we are additive rather than starting from scratch or assuming that we already have answers to questions. And that does take time.
So do we want to talk specifically about the timeline at this point? Should we talk first about the engagement?
Ruth, if I can say, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that they're tied together. And I think, we can't establish a engagement plan or strategy until we know how much time we have, because if it's on a shorter timeline, we may not be able to do all the things that we would potentially do on a longer term. But I also think on the other piece of it, that what I brought up earlier is, there are 6 committees that are submitting work plans. And so we may have to prioritize certain things and push off other things for certain committees to make sure that we have the capacity to do everything. And so I wouldn't want us to get too deep into, we are doing this at this time prior to that conversation on April 7th. Does that make sense?
Well, I guess I am lost again when you raise this, because it seems to me our job is to propose to the whole, this is the timeline that is the most useful to us, and here is why. And that's what we're here to do today. If ultimately the view is other things are more important, that's the view. But it seems to me our job today is to put forward the timeline that makes sense for us.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, I think you make a lot of, yeah, that makes sense. So maybe
knowing that it could be amended depending on the meeting on April 7th.
Sure.
From what I'm understanding, yes, we're feeling an obligation to kind of like submit date today, yeah, but that it may very well be amended based on all some conversation in the interim time, mm-hmm, and what comes out of how we prioritize.
Right.
The committee.
So then are there ideas maybe on what sort of authentic engagement, which I think is the wording from ESSA, looks like in making a proposal?
Yeah. Let me, some of it is here, but let me throw out some things, which is the way I'm thinking about it is in April and May, we're developing our materials and maybe activities and so on. And then June, and then in April and May is one-on-one engagement with different kinds of people and organizations that are interested in knowing about this. So that's sort of April, May. It's more one-on-ones than not, using sort of the context that all of us here have. We can make a list. And then in June, it's a real public engagement in the sense that, and this is what we want to talk about, but we're having ward meetings, maybe we're inviting people to testify at the state board meeting, maybe we're having a speaker at the state board meeting, maybe we're conducting a survey. So that's sort of how I'm thinking about it, is April, May is simultaneously developing the engagement materials, and 2, doing the kind of the retail outreach engagement to leaders in different sectors or leaders of certain schools or organizations. And then June is sort of in public. So that's what I got. So, and that's pretty much reflected here, although I think what is not really on here is more of the, I really focused more on the big public engagement in July, but it needs to have, to Jacques' point earlier, this earlier engagement, starting with OSSI, but all these other groups that are more retail in these earlier months, with it all coming together in June.
So one other question that I have is the idea then that the committee would also then meet more often in May and June in order to do some of that work, or are we still thinking the once a month is enough for us to have those conversations based on the feedback?
Well, I would just say, more would be better if people have time, but I think a lot of it is developing documents and reviewing documents, and people can do that, not necessarily, like we would want to sign off at meetings, but we could do a lot of the review leading up to it, but I'm open to more. And
I'm going to just throw out a question based on one of the other committees I serve on. So the COVID recovery committee is going to be going like gangbusters in its current plan in the month of May, doing a lot of deep public engagement, survey, focus groups to get a report out in June. So just from my perspective, like I don't know how I do a full-time job and do all the things I've already committed to on committees. If we're also going by really strong and hard April, May, and June on this work. Second question is, I wonder how our staff will have capacity to go hard on those things. Dissertations, and then my other question, and I really ask this sincerely because my sense is that June is going to be a hard month for public engagement because it will be the last month of school. It will be a series of some sort of graduations, whether they be COVID or outdoor, and I don't know. What is your sense of your constituents' availability to deeply engage in June?
is that a question to each person?
Sorry, back on you. Yes.
I mean, my short answer is there's always a lot on the plate. There is always a lot on the plate. Thinking of our people. I mean, right now we're in the middle of a big engagement around where schools are going to go, but I don't have a problem having this as the topic of a ward meeting in June. And I don't have a problem having it a topic in a newsletter so that people have an opportunity to respond, whether it's a survey or just hearing what our proposals are and being in a meeting in June. That's for me. Others?
I'm trying to weigh all the things that I got on my plate as I go back and forth with Dr. Reed. I'm gonna be hard pressed, but I'm gonna do my best to make it happen.
Yeah, I guess we can play it by ear. But as much streamlining as possible would be great. I'm also just wondering if it's the first summer free in a year and a half. So it might be one touch point, but then we might have to like try again, I don't know, fall or something once people finish enjoying the summer. But I mean, sure, let's try it. We can see. But yeah, and then also I think, maybe propose this schedule and then look and see what the other committees are doing. And we might have to, I mean, everybody might have to end up shifting. So
The other thing I would put in here that I didn't raise, which is there's, this is iterative. The way I'm thinking about it is we're doing this up front. We're coming up with a set of recommendations that we're going to put to OSSI, right? And then OSSI's got 8 months, right? And that's going to be iterative too, right? They're going to be developing things. They're going to hopefully be asking us questions. We're going to be taking those questions back out. So it's not like it's one and done. It is, let's get the show on the road. Let's start, let's get our initial set of things here. There's, and again, I don't want to speak for others. I feel like there is a lot of pent up demand for this. So yes, I want to engage. I also know that people want this to start moving. And that will be part of the nature of the engagement. And then we'll,
I think that's all very, very relevant. And one thing that I'm reading as I read some of the things in the chat where Jean-Paul is basically saying we'll have less time. We'll have less capacity with the staff, and it puts more burdens on the members. We're also, if we're agreeing to a timeline, we're also agreeing to that there's more writing in that sense.
That there's more what? I missed that.
There's more, we'll be doing more work. Let me just say it that way. There will be more work because the staff as a whole, his team, they will have less capacity. And I want that to be noted as we try to make that decision. If anybody missed it in the chat.
I did miss it in the chat, so I'm glad you raised it. And I think I'm okay with that. I think. Others, I mean, look,
I understand this timeline for what we're trying to accomplish. I think it's fine for us to use this timeline for our proposal to the full board. I think the two things that I hope we can revisit once we present it to the full board are how does it line up with what other committees are doing? And how can all of us collectively reflect on our available work time versus the workload that the collective committee schedules would ask of us. And then the second thing is what we hear back from these initial meetings with OSSI, because we are operating on an understanding per the conversation between Carlene and John Paul in the chat that there is no ESSA reauthorization, no ESEA reauthorization on the horizon, and that the timeline that has been communicated to us in the past will still stand. So to me, those are the two variables, or like what's going on with other committees and what does that mean for all of us? And what, if anything, has changed from OSSI or ED? And I think so long as we can remain flexible in iterating on this plan in light of those things, this feels like a fine proposed timeline to me.
I'm in agreement with that because that's basically what we were saying, Jessica, at the outset as we start talking about this time, is that it could change. We're going to try to use this as a proposal, understanding that it could change under the variables that you just stated.
And can I just say, I really wasn't looking at the chat. I have to get better at looking at the chat while doing other things. And so now I see the point about the dissertation. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And I just also want to acknowledge I have not read this, so I will. I also think the other issue around the engagement is, again, back to this question of engaging with OSSI. I mean, part of what, I had really been thinking is we want to get this to OSSI early because they're not necessarily keen on this, and we want to make it as easy as possible. If there's an ability to, but if they're willing to take something later and be more iterative about it, that also makes a difference. So just saying. All right. Okay. So John Paul, can you make sure to send me this chat?
Absolutely.
Okay, because I have no idea what's in it, and it probably has a lot of ideas. All right. So, all right, so we'll go with this timeline, understanding that one, the whole board may choose not to go on this timeline because there's other issues. And two, it is in some measure related to whether, how the education department moves forward and how OSSI wants to engage. And the only thing I will just say on that, which is not inconsistent, is just to keep saying that unless we have an agreement from OSSI to do it, if we shift off of this timeline much, we're not going to be able to change the upcoming star ratings. So I just want that to be clear, but I think we're good on where we are. All right.
Can I just want to ask a clarifying question for my own edification, but also to make sure that any members of the public listening hear this. My understanding of how the changes to the rating system have to work are that OSSI would have to bring us an agreed upon set of changes for us to approve, and then would have to take them to Ed to get those changes. So if we hear from OSSI that they are amenable to us handing them a proposal, we have a likely faster timeline, because we can say, okay, great, we'll do our engagement, we'll bring OSSI a proposal, OSSI will review it, run any numbers they need to, make any changes, bring it back to us for approval, then send it to Ed. If OSSI for any reason is reluctant, that may throw a wrench in things, because we will still continue to engage the public and bring forth a new proposal, but they may or may not take it and run with it and bring us anything back. Is that right?
Inevitably, yes.
Okay. Okay. Just like I said, I just want the members of the public who are listening in to hear that, like, where we are is the scope of our authority is we will get feedback from the public and craft a proposal on what we think the best rating system is, but ultimately the ability to approve a proposal is not wholly in our own hands.
And I think that brings us full circle as where we started at the very outset of having a conversation with them, being more collaborative, as we started out in the very top of the conversation in our meeting, was seeing how amenable they are to that, so that does really affect our timeline of what we can do and what we can't do. And I'm looking forward to that conversation. And
that we remain committed to engaging the public and getting these ideas for what we think the best system is, regardless of where OSSI is, but that we're hoping for that collaboration.
Exactly.
Okay. I had a really hard stop at 6, but I now realize that's actually not true. So this was actually set from 4:30 to 6:30. So if people are game, we can now take 15 minutes and talk about engagement, if people are good with that. Is that good?
What was it on the schedule?
It was on the calendar for 4:30 to 6:30.
Oh, I see.
In fact, we always try to do it in an hour and a half. And I was very set on doing it in an hour and a half because I had this other meeting that started at 6, which turns out actually not to start at 6. So
So Ruth says, since she got time, we need to make time, is what she's basically trying to say.
Thank you for putting that in such a lovely way.
Just to put it out there that way. I don't know how much time I can commit another 15 minutes.
15. All right. Let's just throw on the table the engagement, what people are thinking, what they want, what they hope for. I mean, I threw out some ideas, but.
I think one thing that we did not have at our disposal the previous time that allows us to be very efficient with engagement and stuff like that is a lot of the ways that we do surveys and stuff like that and narrowing it down. A lot of things that are technologically able for us to engage folks and to get their opinions on what do you want, what would you like to see, are a lot easier at this particular time. So I see us using those mechanisms. I think we use them in campaigns and things like that. We've used them in other areas for for the State Board of Education, so that allows us to use those mechanisms. I just want us to be very cognizant that we have some means to get this done pretty quickly once we formulate what those questions and things look like.
My chief concern is that we hear from a broader set of the public than those who we hear from often. So I know we'll hear from members of the public who are repeat testifiers at our meeting. I know we'll hear from the ward education councils. I think those folks are really important proxies for what members of the public are thinking, but I think they represent a slice of the whole public who uses things like the DC school report card where the star ratings are, or My School DC, where you can see the star ratings. So I just hope that we think about engagement in the broadest sense possible to say, how can we engage users of My School DC, for instance, to get their take on how useful the information on the star rating has been for them, what changes they would want to see. Could we use ANCs as a vehicle to reach more members of the ward-based public than those who might self-select to come to ward education council meetings? So that's my chief concern, is just how do we get the largest number of members of the public who do engage with the star rating in the various places they find it to be engaged in a conversation about what's in it or what could change.
Agreed. I know for me as an East of the River resident and going through this, previously with the task force and stuff like that, we have to do a much better job of getting the voice of those who have been disenfranchised in a lot of sense and has not engaged, hasn't really looked at this, but it truly affects them and their schools that they attend and everything like that after the fact. And I think your proposal of really going to some ANCs, I can think of people right off the top of my head of ANCs that I would love to go to and to have their engagement and to present. And I think we have obligation to do that, to kind of go to those communities and meet them where they are, as opposed to asking them to come to us and how we usually get the normals, the usual individuals who respond.
So I have a question here. So when you think of this, are you thinking, are we thinking about maybe creating sort of some tools, a discussion guide, a pro and con, some forms, some surveys, whatever, and then each of us is sort of going out to our communities? Is that?
I think it's going to take various levels, to be honest with you. I think, we did that. We saw what we received during the task force time. They actually gave us some information, and it was incumbent on the task force members actually to go out and engage and then come back and report to who they had engaged. Literally, that was the process that was used during the initial stage of this. And we just basically, and if some did well at it, some of us didn't, just to be honest, and didn't report out. And as we can see, there were groups that were seriously left out in this engagement aspect. And so I would like to see us use some other means of engaging folks so that we get a wider feel of what it should look like. Not just us, not just incumbent on us engaging the individuals, but other means of engaging other people who can also spread this information for us that has trust in the community.
Can I ask a question? One way that I'm able to be in pretty good touch with our schools is we have a good listserv of all of our parent leaders who can then raise things at like PTA meetings. And we have listservs for not every school, but many of the schools. So you can sort of send stuff direct. To what extent do those things exist that you can rely on?
So I would say among the 35 schools in Ward 6, there's wide variation in how folks communicate. So there's a core group of DC public schools that I think are in strong touch with the Ward 6 public school parent organization. And they are parents who are part of that organization that are parent leaders. But then there are other schools in DCPS within the ward where there's not that same level of connectivity to the ward-based group. And that ward group does not include charters at all. So with charters, I would typically go to the charter leaders directly and have them send out things to their families through their newsletter. Or if I'm looking to connect with the leaders, to go through the DC Charter Alliance, which all the charter leaders are a member of. And then I get that to the LEA leaders. I have a mailing list of all the DCPS principals and all the DC public charter school principals and school leaders in the ward. But there's not, to your point, Ruth, just sort of a singular distribution network.
And I think that's important, Jessica, what you just said about school leaders, because as I've said before, we're dealing with two types of ecosystems where there's some imbalance there, whereas, charter schools, a lot of them are one-offs unless they're like us, KIPP, and some friendship that have multiple campuses and schools across the board and stuff like that, where, that things happen on DCPS, but there's a lot of one-offs on the charter side. And I want us to make sure, because I got so much grief from principals in particular. I happened to actually, when we're going through this process, was in a course at the Georgetown program. And I had 19 leaders come out of one of their meetings when we were about to have class, and they're like, Jacques, this is horrible. Why didn't anybody talk to us about this STAR thing that you guys are about to do? And people literally coming up to me. In fact, I was in there with Dr. Sunday of Henley, and she came and was like, Jacques, you my guy, but I'm just so pissed at you. You guys put this together without any informative information from us whatsoever. So I would like to see us make sure that we do get that information this time around. It was already cooked, baked, and ready to serve by the time they even were able to talk about it, really.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, Jacques. Like when I think about school leaders in Ward 6, I send it to all the principals as well as the charter LEA leaders, so that like I'm sending it to the principals at Center City Shaw and Center City Capitol Hill and the executive director of Center City. And I'm sending it to the principals at each of the 3 KIPP campuses and to Allison Fansler. So making sure I'm touching all my bases on the levels within LEAs. But I think to your point, Ruth, like the other question that I have is that I don't want to smooth over the real power imbalances that exist within some of our school parent communities in Ward 6. I have some school communities where the parent leadership of parent organizations is not reflective of the makeup of the school. And so I don't want to assume that the parent leaders are reflective of the perspective of all parents at the school.
And is there a mechanism, I guess more what I'm thinking is, do they or you or the school have a mechanism like a listserv where most parents are looking at what, seeing that information, and again, I don't know what is standard in other places, but I would say pretty much everywhere, all of our schools, and we have many fewer than everybody else. There's a principal's note that goes out each week that really, pretty much gets to everybody. It goes out both on paper and online, and there's listservs at most. I don't know that it's all of the schools. So that's another way that, you're sort of reaching parents, not, you're reaching the leaders, but you're also reaching the parents. And obviously that makes it easier.
I would love to hear from Carlene in the sense of, I think my experience has been that does not exist in East of the River, where there's one kind of like listserv where people are kind of going to parents and stuff like that. It's more of us reaching out to individuals because we have listservs that we can kind of like have always known and used, and they're veritables. They're like, I use like 6 listservs to get information out sometimes at any particular time to talk to parents. We don't have one that they're all going to, so it's going to be a lot of work. And I would love to hear from Carlene as what it looks like for her.
Yeah, I just put in the chat. I've been just collecting email addresses and contact information as I go to build it out. But I'm thinking, well, 2 things to respond to your question, Jacques. I know Ebony Rose is mentioning, pairing with the collaborative and also watching the work that we're doing with the vaccine event in Ward 8. There are certain though community orgs that have really large lists, like, of course, like Martha's Table and Far Southeast Collaborative. And they've been using their list and communications to kind of, grab people. And then also I know Ebony Rose was mentioning about like, looking at events that they already have folks signed up for and tagging onto that. But I'm thinking something else outside of that. I'm wondering about EdFest, and I'm not sure the timeline, even if it's virtual, if there could be a method for collecting that information, or even if it's in person by chance. I'm not sure we would do that this soon, but having a table and sticky notes or something more sophisticated, the grab giveaway, even if it's virtual, post a virtual table. And I'm not sure, I didn't participate in the virtual one this time around, but I've been doing some like virtual seminars or conferences, and they have like virtual booths, and people can stop by and drop little, like, can get little swag items, but you can drop like comments. And then even having then for those who really want to get into it, I know like when EdFest goes on, they usually have a like little side, like some chairs on the side where there's some sessions that folks can dip into as they're taking turns, going around to booths. So just wondering if, I know it's usually December, and I don't see the timeline up on here, but just wondering, because you get thousands, I'm not sure, it's a bunch of people that come to EdFest consistently. And that would be a great opportunity, just if we can't do it for this, which we possibly should though, because EdFest is basically a DC report card, like a baby of that almost, or at least it's in line, I think. But where else do you get thousands of DC parents on a Saturday?
Jacques said his computer died. It looks like he's trying to come back to us.
It did. I'm back. That happens in the course of work. I've been going all day, and it told me, it warned me, but I didn't think I thought I had a little bit more juice, 15 more minutes worth of juice.
Living on the edge, Jacques.
Always, always. You know how we do in Ward A. Come on now.
I was gonna say, I'm picturing those people whose gas tanks are always on full, and folks who maybe like me get it down to like 7 miles to go.
Look, I go down to the lines. Where them lines go, I got 15 more miles when those lines pop up and no more numbers are up there. Yeah, I always live on the edge.
I'm of the, if it gets to a quarter tank, it's empty. Fill it up.
So safe.
I do want to ask real quickly, because I think, Dr. Reed, your point about EdFest is really a good one. And I'm wondering if, and I'm specifically asking you and Mr. Patterson this, like, what are there any groups that we could partner with in this work to actually get to the people who are not on listservs, who are not parent leaders, but have the input that we are seeking? Like, how do we, like, what are the organizations and groups and things that we can talk to? In the previous ESSA rounds, we did talks at churches, we did talks at anyone that we could find that would say yes, we would go and have a meeting with. And so I just want to make sure that like we're thinking beyond just the current existing things versus like, how do we latch on to other people's networks that have the voices that we want to hear from that we don't usually.
You have the civic. Now that you got my thoughts going to John Paul. We have a few. One thing I've learned, Jock was always talking about, or earlier, you kept mentioning like your campaign. One thing I learned, like Ward 8 has a lot of retired educators. Of course, families, but like a retired educators, and who are love giving their opinion about the state of education. And we have to say that we also have a lot of civic organizations, or not a lot, but a few civic organizations that have pretty strong numbers, or at least enough like reach. So that could be one. And I appreciate what you mentioned, John Paul, about, rolling in the faith community. I'm also thinking like Anacostia Coordinating Council.
That's where I was going. That was going to be my go-to because they're used so often, specifically east of the river, because they're both Ward 7 and 8. Although their name is Anacostia Coordinating Council, they have such a far reach and they're heavily watched. and they promote very strongly. Their promotion is very strong, that you can get responses from them. Even if you're not attending their meetings, they promote very well at getting people to weigh in on things that they feel are pertinent. So yeah.
One question I have, and this is probably to John Paul, maybe also to Jessica, because you're on the committee, is I assume that the COVID group wants to also do a lot of outreach, and these ideas are such great ideas, and to get a survey out. And so one thing is, if we prevail and are part of sort of the first round of committees to do this work, it could make sense to have a survey that is on paper, that is both the COVID piece and this piece, that goes out far and wide through all of these different things that we're talking about. And it's sort of, we talk about this a lot, and I think we do get better over time, but it becomes a way to really use those networks and sort of see how we can use them, get it out there.
Yeah, the COVID group has decided, at least initially, to focus pretty narrowly on principles, because we think that based on what we're hoping, the timeline we're hoping to work on, we wouldn't be able to do sort of citywide outreach, and the principals are being given a lot of decision-making authority by DCPS in terms of school reopening, school planning for summer, et cetera, et cetera. So I agree. These are all excellent ideas, and I'm super excited about using them for our engagement work. But just to your narrow question, Ruth, the COVID group is focusing pretty narrowly on school principals.
Okay. And I guess we'll know more after the working meeting. I mean, maybe there's other groups that are interested in doing a survey that we can sort of be part of, so that the work is being done on part of multiple committees / issues, but I guess we'll know that after.
Something to include, thinking about leading the outreach and advocacy group. That was a great suggestion, I believe, from Malayo, I think, was, talking points. And we might need, depending, like if we Porch Fest, are there certain topics if someone approaches you that we want to, present to people, the consistency of messaging, or at least presentation, so that we don't, it's almost like a research project in my head, like don't skew, collect information without, skewing thoughts in any way, but then also like, how do you, get people sometimes thinking, because some people will come to the table and they have, like you say, what do you consider a high quality school? And they'll like ramble it off. And then sometimes, folks just need something to kind of get their thoughts, going. But then even if it's, so, it could be talking points like those kind of porch events I saw, or, we're talking about like pop-up testimony and the group jock between me, you, Ebony, where, finding events in the community to just have a bunch of people. But then there are going to be certain events, like if you hosted the Anacostia Coordinating Council, or a civic association, they often want a presentation before they open, you open it up to, because it's more of an informative event, and then the community gives you feedback. And in that case, you probably have 10 minutes that you need to sit and inform the public. And we might need some consistency if we, each of us board members go out and engage our constituents.
Yeah, and to that point, and Jacques, you may remember this better than I am, but if I remember correctly, the ESSA task force did some of that too, right? Where we created sort of like talking points for the individual members to go out and talk about XYZ during particular parts of that discussion, right?
That is correct. Like I said, in a certain amount of way, we kind of like gave them the talking points, the elevator speech, to keep them on cue, so to speak, or on pace. Now, to Jessica's point, we don't want to narrow it to the point where we don't have legitimate discussion, but we did give some talking points so that we could stay on message and get the information that we needed to inform us. So yes, and that was done a few times, and then we had to report that back to us. But literally, they came and gave us almost like a package, so to speak, that we took out, and we held those meetings. They framed those meetings for us. All I had to do is basically gather the people up and then put it together. Is what happened. Like I had mine at that time. I was at Rocket Ship. I brought in parents and had one there at Rocket Ship.
All right, guys. It's 6:15. It's actually 6:18. So this was great. I really appreciate this. I have a lot of notes. we have something to forward in terms of a schedule. I think part of what I'm going to do, I hope in concert with Jacques, is start to put together sort of maybe a list of the kinds of things that we would want to have at engagement that then become sort of the basis of the things that we're developing that will help us think things through, and we'll bring them there. So that will consider that what we'll do in April. And the other thing is, if people feel like their schedules can handle another meeting in April, let us know. I'm not sure what appetite there is for that, but if there is, we could do that. So with that, any final notes for the good and order of everybody? All right. Okay, everybody off to their classes and their meetings and their dissertations. And thank you guys. It was a great meeting, and I have full notes here. So thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone.